Hi guys, and welcome to another fursuit building tutorial. So in this video I'm going to follow on from the last couple of videos about making paws, and I'm just going to show you the other method of adding paw pads, which is the applique method. On the screen now you can see everything that I'm going to be using to make my paw pads. So I've got the fur with the pattern piece traced on, including the actual pads themselves. I've cut this quite widely around the edge just to make it a little bit easier to thread through the machine in a moment. I've got a slicker brush and a comb for brushing the fur out of the seams. I've got various pairs of scissors. I highly recommend the small ones, but other than that I've just got some fabric scissors and some general ones. You'll want some pins for pinning your applique fabric. You'll want your fabric for your paw pads, which I'm using an anti-pill polar fleece. You can also use a minky or something like that, and a sewing machine. So I'm going to start by roughly cutting the fabric for the paw pads out into the same sort of size and shape as the fur that I'm using. Now you're going to want to pin that fabric to the front of the fur, keeping it as even as possible. So try and pin it at different sort of intervals and make sure it doesn't get bunched up too much in any particular place. Using a straight stitch, you sew this from the back using a matching coloured thread to the paw pad fabric that you're going to be using. So just trace over those lines, keeping it as smooth and steady as you possibly can. Don't pull on the fabric anywhere because this will distort the shape. You don't need to do any back stitching because this is basically just a tacking stitch to keep the fabric there before you go over the edges. Remove the pins and just trim down that excess thread. Next step is to use those small pair of scissors that we talked about to get as close to the very edge of these pads as you can as you trim around them. You want to keep this really close up to that stitching. This is quite important because the smaller that is, the easier it's going to be to hide later. Really take your time on this step. There is absolutely no need to rush. You just want to get that seam on the edge there as thin as you possibly can, trying not to cut any of the fur fibres around the outside edge. Once you're happy that you've trimmed that all down neatly, you're going to want to brush all of the fur out of the seams. So for this I really like my metal tooth comb, and I also use the slicker brush as well in places just to tidy it up at the end. Now is the scary bit. So what we're going to be doing is a really fine zigzag around the outside of these pieces, just between the sort of tacking thread that we've done and the edge of the fabric that you've cut. So every different machine has totally different settings on how to do this, so what you want to do is practice on some scrap fabric first. You're trying to get a really close zigzag stitch that doesn't really have a gap. Quite often this will be like a buttonhole setting or something like that. You don't want this zigzag to be too wide because it will just look a little bit unsightly, but you also don't want it too small because you want to make sure you cover those edges very well. The trick to getting this really neat is to 1, go really slowly, and 2, do not force the fabric through the machine at all. I cannot stress that enough. What I'll do later on is show you what happens when you do pull that fabric as it goes through the machine, because what it does is just distorts the stitching edge completely. So keep your hands on it, but just guide it around those corners nice and slowly. Don't pull it at all. You may need to stop and lift up the presser foot just to stop the fabric or fur from getting wrinkled or trapped underneath. Trim those threads, and now if you'd like to have a stuffed paw pad, you can take your small pair of scissors or a craft knife and make a small slit in the fur in the back. You can then stuff through this gap and then sew up with a ladder stitch. If you're lining your paws, this is completely fine because it's going to be under the lining anyway. If you're not lining them, you may want to make sure you've got really neat stitching, really tight stitching that's not going to aggravate the hand. You can stuff each of the individual fingers. It doesn't work quite so well on this pattern, which is why I'm not, and I quite like that there's a bit more dexterity in the fingers. And it's as simple as that. From this point you can cut your piece out and then sew it together to the paws finally, which is just the same process as I covered in my previous video. So just quickly to show you guys what can happen if you do this wrong. If you pull the fabric in any direction while you're running it through the machine, or if you try and go too fast, then what will happen is the stitching will stretch the fabric, but not the rest. So it'll come out all wrinkly and horrible, and it just doesn't look very nice. As well as this, if you cut close to your edge before you do this, you can get the fur caught underneath when you're doing the zigzag stitching, which causes it to rip, and it looks bad, and the pattern won't fit. So if you just give yourself a little bit of extra space around the edge, you cover yourself for that mistake, really. And with that, thank you very much, guys, for watching. So this has been the second method for adding paw pads to any of your fursuit paws. Like I say, not necessarily my favourite, but it does work for many people. If you like this video and you haven't already, please do, come and subscribe and keep an eye out for more of my video uploads. I'm trying to upload weekly for you, different fursuit tutorials and showcases and things like that. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. A huge thank you to all the patrons that make these videos possible by supporting us. If you'd like to help too, please head to patreon.com/Kloofsuits.